She hurled her engagement ring into the storm drain, and the man who put it on her finger didn't even look back. One night. One accident. One decision by a stranger at a bus stop in the pouring rain, and everything changed. This is the story of a woman who lost her empire, her legs, and the people she trusted most, and the single father who had nothing to offer but everything that mattered. If you're watching from Chicago, Dallas, Phoenix, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if this one moves, you subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens next. The ring hit the metal grate with a sound so small it shouldn't have meant anything, but Evelyn heard it. She heard it over the thunder. Over the rain, hammering the pavement in sheets so thick the streetlights had turned into blurs. Over the sound of her own breathing, ragged, disbelieving, the kind of breathing you do when your body hasn't caught up with what your mind already knows. The ring was gone. And so was Richard. She watched the taillights of his silver Mercedes disappear around the corner, and for a long moment she didn't move. Couldn't move. That was partly the wheelchair, and partly something else. Something heavier than paralysis, heavier than rain, heavier than anything she had words for at 11:47 on a Tuesday night in October. The bus shelter offered about 16 inches of dry concrete on each side. The rest was open to the storm. Her left wheel sat in a puddle. The right side of her blazer was soaked through. She hadn't eaten since a protein bar at 2 in the afternoon, and even that felt like a lifetime ago. She reached into her coat pocket for her phone. The screen lit up. 43% battery. 3 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize. And a text from her father sent 40 minutes ago while she'd still been in the restaurant, while Richard had still been sitting across from her, while she'd still believed stupidly that the evening might end differently than it did. She opened the text. "Don't come back to the house tonight. Don't come back at all. You made your choices, Evelyn. So did I. The lawyers will be in touch by Friday." She read it twice. Then she turned the phone face down against her thigh and looked out at the rain. 6 months ago, Evelyn Carter had been on the cover of Forbes. Not a profile piece, not a sidebar. The cover. Her face, her name, the headline, "The woman rebuilding American infrastructure, one algorithm at a time." She'd built Cartatech from a 3-person startup in her apartment to a $900 million logistics company in 11 years. She'd done it without a co-founder, without a trust fund, without anyone handing her a single thing she hadn't clawed for herself. Then came the accident. A delivery truck ran a red light on the 101. Her driver swerved. The car hit the guardrail at 62 miles per hour. She woke up in a hospital bed in San Francisco 3 days later and was told in careful, measured language that the spinal cord injury was complete. T6 level. That the paralysis was permanent. That she would not walk again. She had nodded. She had said, "Okay. What's the recovery timeline?" And the doctor had paused in that particular way that doctors pause when they don't want to repeat something they've already said. She had nodded again. "Okay," she'd said again. She hadn't cried. Not then. Not in the hospital. Not in the 3 weeks of acute care or the 2 months of inpatient rehab. She had cried exactly once since the accident alone in a bathroom 6 weeks into her return to the office, when she'd caught her reflection in the mirror and hadn't recognized the woman looking back. That woman had looked exhausted, defeated, like someone who had already stopped fighting. Evelyn had dried her face, gone back to her desk, and worked until midnight. Chapeau. But the company hadn't waited for her to recover. That was what no one said out loud. That was what lived in the careful professional language of every board meeting she'd been wheeled into over the following months. Strategic realignment, shareholder confidence, operational continuity, translation. The board had decided somewhere in those 3 days she'd been unconscious that a CEO in a wheelchair was a liability they hadn't budgeted for. Her father was on the board, Gerald Carter. 71 years old. 3-piece suits, a handshake that had closed deals on 4 continents. He had never once said he was proud of her. Not when she made her first $1 million. Not when she landed the Department of Defense contract that put Cartatech on the national map. Not even when the Forbes cover came out, he'd texted her a single line, "Good photo." But he had been the one to call the emergency board meeting. He had been the one to present the motion. He had been the one to look her in the eye across that conference table and say with the particular kind of gentleness that is worse than cruelty, "Evelyn, you need time to heal. This is what's best for you." She had been removed from her own company on a Wednesday afternoon in late August. She had driven straight to Richard's apartment. Richard Hale, her fiancé of 8 months. Tall, handsome in a deliberate way, a corporate attorney who wore his ambition like a cologne. You smelled it before he walked into the room. She had loved him in the way busy people love, in between things, in the margins of a calendar that never had enough white space. He'd been wonderful in the hospital. Flowers calls long visits where he held her hand and said all the right things. She had believed him. She was not. She would later think a stupid woman, but grief makes you believe what you need to believe. She'd arrived at his door that Wednesday afternoon, and he'd opened it, and she had known immediately from the way he stood in the doorway rather than stepping aside that something had already been decided. "We should talk," he said. "Yeah," she said. "We should." That conversation had taken 3 weeks to finish. Which was how Evelyn found herself on a Tuesday night in October, sitting across from Richard at Carano's, the Italian place where he'd proposed, where the maitre d' still called her Miss Carter and brought her the corner table without being asked, listening to him explain in the same careful, measured language everyone had started using around her that he needed space to reassess. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means—" He loosened his tie. "A tell." She'd always known him by his tells. "It means I've been thinking about the future. Our future. And I want to be honest with you because you deserve honesty. Richard, I'm not the right person for this chapter of your life." She stared at him. "I need someone," he said, and stopped. Tried again. "I'm not equipped." "Don't," she said quietly. "Evelyn." "Don't finish that sentence." He finished it anyway. He was not equipped, he said, for this level of need. He was not in a position at this stage of his career to take on the kind of emotional weight that came with. And here he paused, as if searching for a word that wouldn't sound as monstrous as what he was actually saying her situation. She had taken the ring off her finger. She'd looked at it for a moment. The diamond had cost $46,000. She had paid for it herself because she made 4 times what he made, and she'd wanted the ring she'd wanted, and it hadn't seemed important at the time. She'd set it on the table between them. "You should go," she said. "Evelyn." "I said go, Richard." He went. She sat at the table for 20 minutes after he left, ordered a glass of water, didn't drink it. Then she'd called her father because there was no one else to call, because that was the particular arithmetic of a life spent building a career instead of friendships, and had told him calmly what had happened. There had been a long silence on the other end. Then, "Come home tonight. We'll figure this out in the morning." She had believed him. She'd gotten a taxi to the house, the estate in Palo Alto, where she'd grown up, the house she'd helped pay the property taxes on for the last 6 years, and had been halfway up the driveway when her phone buzzed. His text. "Don't come back to the house tonight. Don't come back at all." She had sat in the driveway for a long moment, the rain starting overhead, and then she'd told the taxi driver to just drive. Just go. She hadn't known where. Just away from the driveway, away from the lights in the upstairs windows, away from the text that was still glowing on her phone screen. The driver had let her out at a bus stop 2 miles away when she'd stopped being able to give him directions. The rain was getting worse. A car passed without slowing, then another, then nothing, just the hiss of water on asphalt and the distant groan of thunder rolling in from the bay. Evelyn's hands were shaking. Not from cold, or not only from cold. She pressed them flat against her thighs, a habit from the early rehab days, when the occupational therapist had told her that proprioceptive grounding could help manage the sensation of disconnect, of not feeling the body you were told you still had. Her thighs didn't shake. She couldn't feel them. She picked up her phone again and opened her contacts. She scrolled. There were 412 contacts in her phone. Investors, Executives, board members, journalists, 2 senators, a handful of people she'd gone to college with and never spoken to again, the woman who did her dry cleaning. She scrolled for a long time. She could not find a single person she could call. Not because the numbers weren't there. Because she understood at 11:54 on a Tuesday night in October, sitting in a puddle at a bus stop in the rain with a dead engagement, and a father who had just locked the door, that not one of those 412 people had ever been in her life for her. They'd been in her life for Cartatech, for the access, for the meeting she could get them, the connection she could make, the deal she could facilitate. She put the phone back in her pocket. This is it, she thought, not dramatically, not the way it sounds in movies, just quietly, matter-of-factly, the way you think when you've run out of alternatives and your hands are shaking and your left wheel is sitting in a puddle. This is actually it. She didn't hear the truck pull up. The rain was too loud. What she heard was a door, and then footsteps, heavy, deliberate work boots on wet concrete, and then a voice that said with a kind of careful steadiness that caught her off guard, "Hey, you doing okay?" She turned. He was standing at the edge of the shelter. Mid-40s, maybe the kind of face that had been weathered by something more than weather. Dark jacket, jeans, paint on the back of one hand that the rain hadn't washed off. He was holding a paper cup in each hand, steam rising from both in the cold air. He'd clearly just come from the 24-hour diner across the street. She looked at him. "I'm fine," she said. He looked at her, really looked the way people don't usually look when they ask that question. And then he looked at the rain and the puddle, and her hands still pressed flat against her thighs. "You don't look fine," he said. Not unkindly, just honestly. "I'm aware," she said. He didn't move, didn't leave, just stood there at the edge of the shelter like he was working something out. "Do you have somewhere to go tonight?" he asked. She opened her mouth to say yes. She closed it again. "No," she said. The word came out smaller than she intended. He nodded slowly. He held out one of the paper cups. "Coffee," he said. "Black. Sorry, I didn't know how you take it." She stared at the cup. "You don't know me," she said. "No," he agreed. "I don't. Why are you giving me coffee?" He thought about it for a second, like it was a real question that deserved a real answer. "Because you're sitting in the rain," he said. "And it's almost midnight, and because my daughter would never forgive me if I drove past someone sitting in the rain at midnight and didn't stop." He said it simply. No performance in it. Just the flat, unadorned truth of a man who had decided somewhere between the diner and the bus stop that this was what you did. Evelyn looked at the coffee. She thought about the ring at the bottom of the storm drain. She thought about her father's text still glowing in her pocket. She thought about 412 contacts and not a single call to make. Then she reached out and took the cup. It was warm. That was the thing that broke her. Not the kindness, not the words, not even the gesture itself. Just the warmth. Just the simple physical fact of something warm in her hands on the worst night of her life. Her eyes filled. She didn't let them spill. She'd had a lot of practice not letting them spill. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. "I'm Connor," he said. "Connor Webb." "Evelyn." He nodded like her name was enough. Like he wasn't waiting for a last name, a title, a company affiliation, anything that would tell him whether she was worth talking to. "There's a diner across the street," he said. "It's warm. And I think they've got pie if you're into that." She almost laughed. She hadn't come close to laughing in months. "You're inviting a stranger to get pie," she said. "I'm inviting someone sitting in a puddle to come in out of the rain," he said. "The pie is secondary." She looked at him for a long moment. Long enough that most people would have looked away, gotten uncomfortable, started explaining themselves. He didn't. He just stood there, patient rain dripping off the edge of the shelter behind him, like he had nowhere else to be and nothing else to prove. She had spent 11 years reading people. Investors, rivals, partners, attorneys. She had built a $900 million company on her ability to know, within the first 4 minutes of a meeting, exactly who she was dealing with. She looked at Connor Webb for a long moment. "Pie sounds okay," she said. He stepped aside to make room for her chair without being asked, without making it a thing, without the particular brand of performative helpfulness that made her want to scream. He just moved. Naturally. Like it was nothing. Because to him, she realized it was nothing. She pushed toward the diner. Behind her, she heard him fall into step, not hovering, not rushing ahead, just walking alongside at the same pace she set. The rain hammered the pavement. The streetlights made halos in the wet air. And for the first time in 6 months, maybe longer, Evelyn Carter did not feel entirely alone. She didn't know yet what that meant. She didn't know yet that the man walking beside her had a daughter named Sophie, who collected soup can labels for art projects and asked too many questions and laughed with her whole body. She didn't know that he was navigating grief of his own, the quiet, devastating kind that no one talks about because it doesn't make headlines. She didn't know that the house he drove a used pickup truck home to every night was small and loud and full of the kind of warmth she hadn't known she was starving for. She didn't know any of that yet. She only knew the coffee was warm, and she was still here. And for right now, on the worst night of her life, that was enough. The pie was apple, warm with a crust that had clearly been there since the afternoon, served by a woman named Darlene, who called everyone Han, and refilled coffee without being asked. It was nothing like the restaurants Evelyn had eaten in for the past decade, and she ate every bite. Connor sat across from her and didn't ask questions. That was the first thing she noticed. He ordered coffee, wrapped both hands around the mug, and let the silence sit between them without trying to fill it. Most people couldn't do that. Most people faced with a woman in a wheelchair at a bus stop at midnight would have needed to know the story, needed to categorize, to understand, to find the place where the situation made sense. Connor just drank his coffee and let her eat her pie and said nothing until she was ready. She was the one who spoke first. "I was a CEO," she said. "Not planned. It just came out. Tech company. Logistics software. 9 years I built it." He nodded. Didn't react to the was. "6 months ago, I was in a car accident," she said. "And then, fairly quickly after that, I wasn't a CEO anymore." "The accident did that. The accident gave the board an excuse," she said. "The board did the rest." He looked at her steadily. "That's a lot to lose at once. Tonight, I also lost my fiancé and my father," she said. She heard how it sounded coming out of her mouth, almost absurd, the accumulation of it, and something unexpected happened. She almost laughed again. "So, efficient evening." Connor didn't laugh. He didn't do the sympathetic head tilt either. He just said quietly, "I'm sorry, that's a real bad night." "Yeah," she said. "It is." "Where are you planning to go?" he asked. "Tonight, I mean." "I don't know yet." He nodded slowly and turned his mug in a circle on the table. She could see him thinking. Not performing thinking, actually working something through the way a person does when they're about to say something they haven't fully decided yet. "I have a spare room," he said finally. "It's not much. My daughter uses it for art projects, so there's probably glitter on the floor. But it has a door that closes and a bed that works." Evelyn looked at him. "You don't know me," she said again. "You said that already." "I'm saying it again because it's still true. Also still true that it's midnight and raining," he said. "And you just told me you don't have anywhere to go." "I could be anyone." "Could be," he agreed. "But you're not acting like someone I need to worry about." "How am I acting?" He thought about it. "Like someone who's been carrying something heavy for a long time and just put it down and doesn't quite know what to do with her hands." The diner hummed around them. Darlene was wiping down the counter. A man in the corner booth was reading a folded newspaper. The rain kept going. Evelyn thought about the 412 contacts. She thought about the hotel lobby she'd been mentally pricing out, the accessible room surcharge, the cost per night. How many nights her savings could cover before she had to figure out the next step. She thought about going to sleep in a hotel bathroom that smelled like bleach and trying to believe tomorrow would be different. "Okay," she said. Connor looked up. "Okay," she said again. "Thank you." He drove a gray pickup truck that had seen better decades. The passenger door didn't open from the outside, so he got out and opened it for her practically without ceremony, and helped her break down the chair and slide it into the back without asking if she needed help and without acting like it was a production. He just did it. Evelyn noted this the way she noted everything, carefully filing it away, assigning it its proper weight. They drove mostly in silence. The rain had eased to a drizzle. The streets were empty. She watched the neighborhoods change as they moved east, the glass and steel giving way to streetlights and small yards and garbage bins lined up at the curb. "Your daughter," she said. "How old?" "8," he said. "Going on 40. "Who's with her now?" "My neighbor, Mrs. Patel. She watches Sophie when I'm on late calls." He paused. "I do renovation work. The calls come at weird hours sometimes." "What kind of renovation?" "Mostly residential, sometimes commercial. I do a lot of accessibility work, ramps, wider doorways, bathroom modifications. There's more demand for it than people realize." Evelyn looked at him. "Accessibility renovations," she repeated. "Yeah, started doing it after my wife." He stopped, adjusted his grip on the wheel. "After some stuff happened. Needed to learn it for the house, then kept going." She didn't push. He hadn't pushed her. That felt like an agreement they'd reached without discussing it. He pulled into the driveway of a house with a light on in the front window. The porch had a ramp, a good one, she noticed. Proper slope ratio, solid railing, not the flimsy hardware store kind. Someone who knew what they were doing had built that. Inside, Mrs. Patel was asleep on the couch with a game show on mute. Connor woke her, gently exchanged a few quiet words, and walked her next door. By the time he came back, Evelyn had maneuvered herself into the small living room and was looking at the wall of drawings next to the television, dozens of them taped up, overlapping like a collage in crayon and marker, and what appeared to be paint applied with fingers. Houses, animals, people with enormous heads and stick limbs, one that appeared to be a cat driving a school bus. "Sophie's gallery," Connor said from behind her. "She's prolific," Evelyn said. "She'd be offended if you said that. She'd say she's serious about her practice." He said it with the particular fond weariness of a parent who has heard a phrase repeated so many times it's become part of the furniture. "Where does she get that? Honestly, no idea." He moved through the living room toward the hallway. "I'll show you the room." There was, in fact, glitter on the floor, and a half-finished papier-mâché something on the desk that might have been a bird or a small building. The bed had clean sheets. Connor changed them while she waited in the doorway, moving with the quick efficiency of someone used to doing things alone, and there was a bathroom adjacent with a door wide enough for her chair, which she had not expected. "The doorway," she said. "I widened it last year," he said. "Easier to get storage bins in and out." He said it like it was about storage bins, and maybe it was. She didn't comment. "Thank you, Connor," she said. "Really. I'll figure out next steps tomorrow and be out of your way." He shrugged. "Sleep first. Next steps can wait." She slept for 11 hours. She hadn't slept more than 4 in a row since the accident. Sophie found her in the morning. Evelyn heard the door open, a small, careful sound. The sound of a child who has been told not to wake someone up and is testing exactly where the line is, and opened her eyes to find a girl with 2 braids and paint-stained fingers standing in the doorway in her pajamas, staring with the unfiltered, frank curiosity that 8-year-olds haven't yet learned to disguise. "Dad said not to bug you," Sophie said. "Then what are you doing?" "I'm not bugging you. I'm looking at you. Those are different." Evelyn sat up. "Are they?" "Yes, bugging is when you talk too much. Looking is just information." "That's a very specific definition." "I have a lot of definitions." Sophie stepped into the room without being invited, which seemed to be her natural mode of operation. She looked at the wheelchair folded against the wall. "Is that yours?" "Yes." "Do you always need it?" "Yes." Does it hurt? No. Sophie nodded, absorbing this. Dad has a bad knee. His hurts sometimes. He makes a face but says he's fine. That sounds like something dads do. You want breakfast? Dad made eggs. He makes them too dry, but I'm not allowed to say that. You just said it. To you. That's different. She turned and walked back toward the kitchen, with the assumption that Evelyn would follow, which she did, because it was difficult to argue with Sophie, and Evelyn suspected this was not a new phenomenon for anyone who encountered her. Breakfast was eggs slightly dry and toast and orange juice, and Sophie talking almost continuously about a project she was doing on the water cycle for school, and how her teacher, Mrs. Okafor, had said it was the best one in the class, but then also said that to Marcus, so Sophie wasn't sure if Mrs. Okafor was being honest or just nice. Connor sat at the end of the table drinking coffee and making the occasional comment, and watching Evelyn with a low-key, unobtrusive attention that she recognized as the same quality he'd had at the bus stop, the quality of a person who actually sees things. She does this with everyone, he said at one point, nodding at Sophie, who was now explaining the hydrological cycle with a spoon as a prop. I don't mind, Evelyn said, and was surprised to find she meant it. She stayed another day. Then another. It happened the way these things happen when you're not looking. Not as a decision, so much as the absence of one day's accumulating, while she told herself she was regrouping, figuring out the next move, mapping the path forward. The truth, which she wasn't ready to say out loud, was simpler. She didn't want to leave. And she hadn't wanted anything, hadn't felt the pull of want toward something rather than away from something in a very long time. The house was loud in the mornings and quiet in the evenings. Connor left early for job sites, and Sophie went to school, and Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and the legal documents her father's attorneys had begun forwarding to her email. The separation from Cartatech formalized now in 40 pages of language designed to sound fair, and she read through them with the cold focus she'd always been able to find when emotion threatened to make her slow. She called a lawyer, set up a bank account separate from anything connected to Gerald or Cartatech, started making a list. In the afternoon, Sophie came home, and that was when something began to shift. It started with the homework. Sophie was struggling with fractions, had been for weeks, and the worksheets were piling up with the particular defeated energy of a child who has decided she is bad at something and would prefer not to try. Evelyn sat with her at the kitchen table one afternoon and watched her approach the problem, avoidance first, then complaint, then a half-hearted attempt that abandoned itself at the first sign of difficulty. "Can I show you something?" Evelyn asked. "I'm bad at fractions," Sophie said preemptively. "You're not bad at fractions. You're unfamiliar with fractions. Those are different." Sophie looked at her sideways. "That sounds like something a teacher says before the thing is still hard." "It's something that's true before you've tried the right approach," Evelyn said. "Look, what's half of a pizza? Half. How many slices if the pizza has 8 slices? 4. That's a fraction. You just did fractions. Write it down." Sophie looked at the paper with an expression of profound suspicion. Then she wrote it down. They sat for an hour. By the end, Sophie had finished the worksheet not perfectly, but earnestly, with the renewed energy of someone who has discovered that a wall they believed was solid actually had a door in it. She looked at the completed page with an expression that Evelyn recognized, the specific quiet satisfaction of having done something you didn't think you could. "You're good at explaining," Sophie said. "I spent a lot of years explaining things to people who didn't want to listen," Evelyn said. "You're easier." "Because I'm smart." "Because you're honest. When you don't understand something, you say so. Most adults don't." Sophie considered this. "Why not?" "Because they're afraid of looking stupid. But if you don't say it, you stay stupid." "Yes," Evelyn said. "That's exactly right." That night, Connor knocked on her door after Sophie was asleep. "She told me you fixed fractions," he said. "I just reframed it. She's been fighting those worksheets for 3 weeks." He leaned against the doorframe. "Thank you." "It was nothing. I had time." "Can I ask you something?" He said it the way people say it when they've been holding the question for a while. "What are you going to do With the legal stuff, the company, all of it. She had been thinking about this. She had been thinking about almost nothing else underneath everything, running the calculation, the way her mind always ran. Calculations, variables, outcomes, probability weightings. I don't know yet, she said. I know what I don't want to do. What's that? Go back to what I was doing before, building something I didn't. She stopped. Started again. I was good at building Cardatech, but I don't think I loved it. I loved winning. That's different. Connor was quiet for a moment. What would you love? The question sat there. She hadn't been asked it before. Not by anyone. Not even by herself. I don't know, she said. That's terrifying, actually. To not know. Yeah, he said. I know that feeling. She looked at him. Your wife, she said carefully. He exhaled. Laura. She passed 3 years ago. Ovarian cancer, 14 months from diagnosis. He said it with the flatness of something that has been said often enough to lose its sharpest edge, but still had weight. Sophie was 5. She remembers some things. Not enough. I'm sorry, Evelyn said, and she meant it not in the reflexive social way, but in the way you mean something when you've recently held your own version of loss, and you understand it isn't a word but a geography. I stopped knowing what I wanted after that, he said. For about 2 years. He made a gesture, moved through things, kept the lights on for Sophie, didn't think past the next week. And now I think maybe a little further than that, he said. Slowly, she nodded. The ramp, she said. On the porch. He looked at her. You said you started doing accessibility work because of stuff that happened. Was it Laura? He was quiet for a moment. Last 6 months, she needed her mobility was affected. I learned to modify the house so she could move through it herself, so she didn't have to ask for help every time she wanted to go from one room to another. He stopped. Seemed like a small thing to be able to give her. Evelyn didn't say anything for a long moment. It wasn't small, she said. No, he agreed. I don't think it was. The week settled into a rhythm that Evelyn hadn't known she was capable of anymore. Coffee in the mornings. Legal calls and planning work through the day. Sophie in the afternoons. Evenings that sometimes ended with Connor at the kitchen table across from her, talking the kind of talking that starts with safe things and slowly over time, with trust accumulated in small deposits, moves into the real ones. She learned that he had grown up in rural Ohio and come west at 22 with a construction apprenticeship and a duffel bag. That he had loved Laura for 16 years since they were both 26, and she was teaching 3rd grade, and he was redoing the floor of her classroom, and she had told him on the first day that she needed the baseboard to match the existing trim exactly because she was particular about things, and he should know that up front. He had matched it exactly and asked her to dinner, and they had argued about it at dinner, and he had thought the whole time that she was the best person he'd ever met. Evelyn told him about Cardatech. Not the Forbes version, the real one. The years of 18-hour days and skipped meals and decisions that had kept her awake until 3 in the morning. The pride she'd felt, and also the isolation, the peculiar loneliness of being the person everyone needed and no one simply liked. The way she had traded so many ordinary things, weekends, friendships, the chance to just sit somewhere and not be working, and told herself it was worth it. Was it? Connor asked one night. I thought so, she said. I'm not sure anymore. What changed? She thought about the bus stop, the puddle, the ring hitting the drain. I lost everything, she said. And then you gave me coffee. And then your daughter explained to me that looking and bugging are different things. And I realized I'd been in rooms full of powerful people for 15 years, and none of it felt as real as this kitchen. He looked at her for a moment. That's either a very sad thing, he said, or a very good one. I think it might be both, she said. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet. A dog barked somewhere down the block. The kitchen clock read 11:40. Evelyn had a call with her attorney in the morning, and a list of next steps that was becoming slowly less a list of reactions and more a list of intentions. She was starting for the first time in months to think about what she wanted to build. Not to win, not to prove something, to actually build. She didn't have the shape of it yet, but she could feel the edges of it the way you feel the outline of something in the dark before you can name it. "I should sleep," she said. "Yeah," Connor said. He stood, picked up both mugs, took them to the sink. "Sophie's got a field trip tomorrow. She wants to know if you'll help her pack her lunch in the morning." "She could have just asked me." "She was working up to it," he said. "Her version of asking is telling me to ask." Very efficient. "She's your kind of person," he said. And the way he said it, not flirtatiously, just observationally, like a simple fact he'd noticed and was now reporting, settled somewhere in her chest with a quiet warmth she didn't know what to do with. "Good night, Connor," she said. "Night, Evelyn," he said. She lay in the room with the glitter on the floor and the papier-mâché bird on the desk and the sound of a house settling around her, and she thought about the ring at the bottom of the storm drain and her father's text and the 412 contacts. And then she stopped thinking about them. And for the first time in a very long time, she thought instead about tomorrow. Not as a problem to be solved, as a thing she was quietly and unexpectedly looking forward to. 3 months passed. Evelyn's room still had glitter on the floor. She'd stopped noticing it somewhere around week 5, which she suspected meant something, though she hadn't decided what. Sophie had declared the papier-mâché thing on the desk to be a phoenix retroactively, after the fact, the way artists sometimes do when the work becomes something other than what they planned, and had presented it to Evelyn with the gravity of a museum curator. Evelyn had put it on the windowsill and left it there. She had not gone back to her father's house. She had not called Richard. She had spoken to her attorney 11 times, her former CFO twice, and a journalist from the Wall Street Journal once. That last call she had shut down in under 4 minutes because she was not ready, and more importantly because she had nothing to say, yet that was worth saying. What she had done was work. Not the reactive defensive work of the first weeks, the legal reading, the account separating, the damage mapping. Real work, forward-facing work. She'd been on the phone with a housing nonprofit out of Oakland. She'd had 3 conversations with a disability rights organization in Sacramento. She'd filled 2 legal pads with notes and numbers and questions that didn't have answers yet, but were becoming the right questions, which was always, in her experience, the necessary first step. Connor had looked at one of the legal pads one evening, not prying, just glancing as he set down a mug of coffee and said, "That's a lot of numbers for someone without a company." "I'm building one," she said. And it was the first time she'd said it out loud, and it sounded to her own ears not like a hope, but like a fact. He'd looked at her for a moment and said, "Yeah, I figured," and gone back to his own work at the other end of the table. That was the thing about Connor Webb. He didn't celebrate prematurely. He didn't perform enthusiasm. He just registered what was real and moved on, which Evelyn found, after a lifetime of people who told her what she wanted to hear, to be one of the most trustworthy things about him. She was thinking about that, about trust, about what it was built from, about the difference between the people who showed up and the people who only showed up when showing up was convenient, when her phone rang on a Thursday afternoon in January. She didn't recognize the number. She almost didn't answer. "Evelyn?" Her father's voice. She hadn't heard it since August, since the driveway, since the text, since the night that had ended at a bus stop in the rain. She sat very still. "Gerald," she said. She used his first name deliberately. She'd been practicing that in her head without knowing she was. A pause on his end. He'd expected Dad. She noted that she felt no particular satisfaction in having surprised him. What she felt was colder than that, more contained. "I need to see you," he said. "Why? I think you know why." "I'd like you to say it." Another pause. Gerald Carter was not a man who was asked to say things. He was a man who implied them, allowed them to be inferred, operated in the space between what was stated and what was understood. Evelyn had grown up learning to read that space. She had spent her adult life refusing to inhabit it. "The company is in trouble," he said finally. "Significant trouble. I've read the reports." Then you know the situation. I know a situation, she said. I'd like to hear your version. He exhaled, the sound of a man being asked to do something that cost him something. The executive team has not performed. The infrastructure contracts are behind schedule. 3 major clients have given notice. And the board... He stopped. The board is discussing options that I find unacceptable. What kind of options? Acquisition. There are 2 buyers at the table. Both would dismantle the company within 18 months. Break it up, sell the technology, eliminate the workforce. Evelyn said nothing. I need your help, Gerald said. The words came out flat and careful, the way a man speaks words he has never said before and has no practiced cadence for. What kind of help? Come back. Interim strategic role, whatever structure works legally, given the separation agreement. We can negotiate the terms. I'll bring the board. Gerald. Back into alignment, I have 3 members who... Gerald. He stopped. Why should I? She asked. Quietly. Not with heat. With genuine inquiry, the way she would ask it of a business proposal. What's the logic here? What's the actual argument? Not the emotional pitch, but the real one. The silence stretched long enough that she thought for a moment the call had dropped. Because it's yours, he said. You built it. I know what I... Another stop. I know what happened wasn't right. I know that. Do you? Evelyn, I'm asking seriously. Do you know what happened, or do you know that the outcome was bad, and you're retroactively revising your position because the man you installed in my place has run my company into the ground in 4 months? The silence this time was different. Heavier. Both, he said. If I'm being honest, both. She hadn't expected that. She sat with it for a moment. Gerald Carter admitting to a partial truth was more than she'd gotten from him in 41 years. I'll think about it, she said. The timeline? I'll think about it, she said again. I'll call you. She hung up. She sat in the kitchen for a long time after. The house was quiet. Sophie was at school. Connor was at a site in Fremont. The phoenix on her windowsill caught the afternoon light. She looked at it for a while. Then she called her attorney. Then she called her former CFO, a woman named Patricia Ossie, who had been one of the only people to call Evelyn after the board vote, not to strategize, not to position herself, just to say that was wrong. And I want you to know, I said so. Patricia had been at Cartatech for 7 years. Evelyn trusted her more than anyone she'd ever worked with. I know, Patricia said when Evelyn told her about the call. I've been watching it. Evelyn, it's bad. The Q4 numbers they're about to release, they're going to shake the street, and Harmon has no idea how to stop it. Harmon. Thomas Harmon. The man the board had chosen. Experienced, they'd said. Steady hand. What they'd meant was compliant, familiar, the kind of man who didn't make the room uncomfortable. How bad is Q4? Evelyn asked. Patricia told her. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. Okay, she said. Don't say anything to anyone. I need a few days. She thought about it for those days carefully, the way she thought about the things that actually mattered, not the immediate calculation, but the longer one. Not what was smart, but what was right. Not whether she could, but whether she should, and why, and what it meant about who she was choosing to be. She talked to Connor about it the second night. Not all of it. Not the numbers, not the details, but the shape of it. The question underneath the question. My father called, she said. He wants me to come back and help save the company. Connor looked up from the invoice he was reviewing. Your company, the one he helped take from you. Yes. What do you want to do? I don't know yet. That's why I'm telling you. He set down the invoice. What are the options? I go back, save it, and then what? Run a company I already proved I could run for a board that already showed me what they think of me when things get hard. She shook her head. Or I don't go back and the company gets acquired and dismantled and 400 people lose their jobs. Those aren't the only 2 options, he said. She looked at him. You're thinking about it like it's a binary, he said, but you've got something they need. That means you've got leverage. Have you thought about what you'd actually want in exchange? Not the safe answer, not the obvious things. What would make going back worth it to you? She had thought about it. She'd been thinking about it since she hung up the phone. She'd been thinking about the legal pads covered in numbers, the housing nonprofit in Oakland, the Sacramento meetings, the edges of the thing she'd felt herself building toward. There's something I want to build, she said. Separate from Cardatech, using my father's money and his board connections as seed capital. Connor was very still. Affordable housing with accessibility built in from the ground up, she said. Not retrofitted, designed that way from day one. For disabled families, elderly people, people who currently have to choose between an accessible unit and a unit they can actually afford. She heard herself say it out loud for the first time as a complete thing and felt the same sensation as when she'd told Connor she was building a company, the shift from idea to fact. The renovation model you've been doing, what if that was systematic? What if there was a company whose entire mission was to do at scale what you've been doing one house at a time? Connor hadn't moved. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. What? She said. Nothing, he said. Keep going. I'd go back to Cardatech on one condition, she said. My father funds the new venture. Not a donation and investment. Real capital, real terms. And he opens the board network to early partnerships. In exchange, I stabilize Cardatech, prevent the acquisition, and protect the 400 jobs. And if he says no, then I walk away and build it smaller and slower without him, and Cardatech gets sold. You're willing to let it get sold. I'm willing to let it get sold, rather than go back on someone else's terms, yes. She said it, and felt the truth of it, no performance, no bravado, just the quiet clarity of a decision already made. I spent 9 years building that company, and I would do it again, but not for them. Not for the version of it that exists, because they decided a woman in a wheelchair was a liability. Connor was quiet for a long moment. He's going to push back, he said. Yes. He's going to make it about the company, about the employees, about legacy. Yes. And when all that doesn't work, he's going to make it personal. He's going to try to use the daughter thing. She looked at him. The daughter thing. The I'm your father and I love you and I'm sorry thing. That's the move when everything else fails. She was quiet. You've thought about this. You've been quiet for 2 days, he said simply. I noticed. She looked at him across the kitchen table. The paint that was always on the back of his left hand. The slight lean he had when he was thinking hard, the way he watched her without watching, present, without pressing. She thought about the bus stop. She thought about the coffee. She thought about the question he'd asked her that first night. What would you love? And the fact that she was sitting here with the beginning of an answer. If he makes it personal, she said, I'll know the business case failed, and I'll make my decision accordingly. Yeah, he said. Good. The meeting with Gerald was in San Francisco. A neutral location, his attorney's office, not the Cardatech headquarters, not the house. He'd agreed to that without argument, which told her something about how badly he needed this. She arrived 7 minutes early. She'd dressed the way she always dressed for a meeting that mattered, not to impress, to clarify. She wanted Gerald to look at her and understand immediately that the woman he was meeting was not the daughter who had grown up in his house, learning to interpret his silences. She was the CEO who'd built the company he'd taken from her. That woman was still here. She had not been left at the bus stop. Gerald was already in the conference room. He looked older. Not dramatically, not the collapse she'd half imagined, but in the specific way that stress ages men who are accustomed to controlling things. A tightness around the eyes, a slight compression of the shoulders, the look of a man who has been sleeping badly and knows it shows. He stood when she came in. Evelyn. Gerald. She moved to the head of the table. It was a deliberate choice. He noticed it and said nothing. Thank you for coming, he said. I want to be clear about something before we start, she said. This is a business meeting. I'm here to discuss terms. I'm not here to process what happened in August or to give you an opportunity to explain yourself. If you want to do that at some point separately, I'm open to it. But not today. Today we talk business. He sat down slowly. Understood. Good. She opened the folder on her lap. Here's what I'm proposing. She laid it out exactly as she'd built it. Precise, structured, no excess language. Cardatech stabilization strategy, 12-month timeline, key intervention points. And then the second half, the new venture, the capital requirement, the partnership structure, what she was asking him to provide, and what she was offering in return. He listened without interrupting. That was something Gerald Carter did not listen without interrupting as a rule. He was listening now. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You're asking me to fund a competitor, he said. I'm asking you to fund a social enterprise that doesn't compete with Cardatech's market at any point in the next 10 years, she said. You've read the numbers. You know that's true. The board won't. The board will do what you tell them to do when you have leverage, she said. You have leverage right now. We both know that. The question is whether you use it for this or whether you let two acquisition firms dismantle the company in 18 months. He looked at her for a long moment. The kind of look she'd rarely gotten from him, not assessment, not the calculation she was used to. Something closer to recognition. You're different, he said. Yes, she said. The accident. Not the accident, she said. The 6 months after. He was quiet. I had nothing, she said. It came out more even than she expected. You understand that I had nothing. No home, no company, no relationship, no nothing. And I found out what I was made of when there was nothing left to hide behind. That's the difference. He looked down at the folder. His hands were flat on the table. What you're asking, he started, is fair, she said. I'm saving what you built together with me and asking you to help me build what I should have been building instead. That's fair, Gerald. You know it is. A long silence. Then, I'd want board representation in the new venture. 1 observer seat. No voting rights. 2 members. 1 observer, no vote. That's not negotiable. He looked at her. And then, slowly, with the particular effort of a man rerouting something deep and stubborn in himself, he nodded. I owe you an apology, he said. It came out rough, like something dragged over gravel. What I did in August, the text, the board. Gerald. She said it gently. Business today, everything else later. He nodded again, pressed his lips together, picked up his pen. Send me the full terms by Friday, he said. You'll have them Thursday, she said. She didn't feel triumph on the drive back. She'd expected to, had braced for it even. The vindication, the satisfaction, the closing of a circle. Instead, she felt something quieter, the particular settledness of a person who has walked into the hardest room and come out still herself. She called Connor from the parking garage. How'd it go? He asked. He said yes, she said. A beat. Yeah. He's going to try to renegotiate the observer seat, she said. But he said yes. You knew he would. I knew the business case was sound, she said. I didn't know if he'd actually... She stopped. He looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time, which is either very sad or very late or both. Maybe both, Connor said quietly. Sophie's still awake. Barely. She made you something. Won't tell me what. Evelyn smiled. It moved across her face before she could think about it the way real smiles do. I'll be home in 40 minutes. She pulled out of this garage into the San Francisco evening, and she drove east toward a house with a ramp on the porch and a wall of drawings by the television, and a child who collected words like looking and bugging, as if precision was a form of love. Toward the kitchen table where someone was waiting, who had never needed her to be anything other than exactly what she was. Toward the thing that was waiting to be built. The terms went to Gerald on Thursday as promised. He called Friday morning with 2 proposed amendments. Evelyn rejected one, accepted the other, with a modification, and by Friday afternoon they had a signed letter of intent. Her attorney called it the cleanest negotiation he'd seen in 20 years of corporate law. Evelyn didn't tell him it was because she'd stopped caring about winning and started caring about what she was building toward. That distinction, she suspected, was the whole thing. She spent the following 2 weeks at Cartatech. Not as CEO, the optics of that were complicated, and the legal structure of her return was deliberately ambiguous. A strategic advisory engagement that her attorney had drafted with enough flexibility to mean almost anything. What it meant in practice was that she came in, sat in meetings, asked the questions no one else was asking, and told the truth in rooms where truth had become an endangered species. The first meeting was with the executive team. 7 people around a conference table she'd sat at hundreds of times in a room with her own fingerprints on the wall design. Thomas Harmon sat at the head. He was a careful man. Harmon not unintelligent, but careful in the way that becomes its own kind of failure, the way that prioritizes not being wrong over being right. He welcomed her with a handshake and the particular smile of a man who has been told by his lawyers to be collegial. "Evelyn," he said, "we're glad to have your perspective." "Thank you, Thomas," she said. "Let's look at the Meridian contract first." The smile held, but something behind it shifted. "We were planning to start with the Q4 overview. The Q4 numbers are what they are. We can't change them." She opened her folder. "The Meridian contract renewal is in 11 days, and the current proposal on the table is going to lose it. I'd like to understand why that proposal exists before we spend an hour on numbers that are already public." A silence around the table. Not hostile, more like the silence of people recalibrating. They started with the Meridian contract. It took her 6 days to understand the full scope of what had gone wrong, and it was both worse and more fixable than she'd expected. Worse, because the strategic decisions of the past 4 months reflected a fundamental misreading of what Cartatech actually was. Harmon had been trying to run it like a legacy enterprise software company when its value had always lived in its adaptability, its willingness to build custom solutions that the big players couldn't be bothered with. Fixable, because the core technology was still sound, the engineering team was still largely intact, and the clients who'd given notice had given it reluctantly. The way you fire a contractor you actually liked because the project management fell apart. She called Patricia every evening. Patricia, who had stayed at Cartatech through the transition and hated every day of it with a professionalism so complete it was almost beautiful. Walked her through the internal numbers with the thoroughness of someone who had been waiting for an excuse to say everything she'd been holding. "The Denver infrastructure deal," Patricia said on day 3. They walked it back to a pilot. "Evelyn, I told Harmon in September. I put it in writing. He said the relationship was solid and we'd close in December." And December came. "Who's the contact at Denver?" "Marcus Webb, Senior VP of Operations." "Get me a call." "He's been very careful since the transition." "I know. Get me the call anyway." She got the call. She was direct with Marcus Webb in the way that she'd learned over a career built on directness that people who feel they've been underserved actually want. She acknowledged what had happened, didn't excuse it, and asked specifically what it would take to rebuild the confidence. He told her. She wrote it down and did not argue with any of it. By the end of the call, he agreed to extend the evaluation period another 90 days. "How did you do that?" Patricia asked when Evelyn called her back. "I listened," Evelyn said, "and I didn't try to tell him he was wrong to be frustrated. Harmon would have spent 40 minutes explaining why the delay wasn't our fault. I know, that's why he's losing the contract." She wasn't rebuilding Cartatech because she'd forgiven the board. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself. She was doing it because 437 people came to work in that building, and their ability to pay their mortgages and their kids' school fees had nothing to do with the decisions that had been made in a conference room last August. That was the line she held. It kept the work clean. It kept her from sliding into the particular corruption of doing the right thing for the wrong reasons. Gerald stayed out of her way, which was its own form of respect, and possibly the most respect he'd ever shown her. He called once midway through the second week to ask how it was going. She told him it was going. He said good and hung up, which was also, she recognized, a kind of progress. On day 12, she sat across from Harmon in his office, her old office. The office where she'd worked until 3 in the morning, more times than she could count, and told him clearly, and without pleasure, what was going to happen next. "The board is going to restructure the leadership team," she said. "That's been decided. I wanted to tell you directly, rather than have you hear it through the process." He looked at her steadily. He was a dignified man, she gave him that. "I appreciate it," he said. "You're not a bad executive," she said. "You were put in the wrong company at the wrong time and given bad information about what it needed. That's not entirely your failure." "Generous," he said, a little dry. She respected that too. "I'm not being generous, I'm being accurate." She stood, or rather she moved the small repositioning that had replaced standing in her vocabulary without her consciously deciding it. "There's a VP of operations role at a logistics firm in Portland. Solid company, more traditional structure. I can make a call if you want." He looked at her for a long moment. "You'd do that. The offer is there." "Why?" "Because this isn't personal, Thomas. It never was." He called her 2 days later and said yes to the Portland introduction. She made the call. That was the end of that chapter, clean and without drama, the way she preferred endings. The Carta Tech stabilization took 6 weeks total. It wasn't a transformation, she wasn't there long enough for that, and it wasn't her job. It was a correction. A righting of the ship sufficient to get it pointed in a direction that wasn't toward the rocks. By the time she handed the operational plan to the restructured leadership team and walked out of the building for the last time, 3 of the departing clients had recommitted the acquisition. Conversations had been formally ended, and the Q1 projections were, if not good, at least honest. She drove back east across the bay and felt with each mile the particular exhale of a person who has finished something that needed to be finished and can now begin something that matters. The new company needed a name. She and Connor argued about it for 3 evenings at the kitchen table, which was the most sustained disagreement they'd had about anything, and which Sophie monitored with intense interest from the couch, occasionally offering suggestions that were either genuinely inspired or completely unusable with no middle ground. "Carta Bridge," Connor said on the first night. "No, nothing with Carta. That's the old thing." "Foundation something." "Too non-profit." "We're not a non-profit." "You're sure about that?" "We're a mission-driven company with a sustainable revenue model. There's a difference. Non-profits depend on donations. We can't scale on donations." "Home true," Sophie called from the couch. They both looked at her. "Home," she said with the patience of someone explaining something obvious. "But true, because you're making homes that are actually homes. Because sometimes they're not really homes." A silence. "Where did that come from?" Connor asked. "I've been listening," Sophie said. "For like a month." Evelyn looked at the name she'd written on the pad. Home true. She said it again in her head. "It's not a bad name," she said slowly. "It's a good name," Connor said. He was looking at his daughter with an expression Evelyn had come to recognize, the particular look of a parent watching a child be more than they expected and feeling something about that too large to be called simple pride. "Fine," Evelyn said. "But I want her to get credit for it. On the website." "On the website," Sophie repeated, satisfied, and went back to her book. Home True launched in March. Not with a press release. Evelyn had done enough press releases in her life to know the difference between a launch and a debut. And a launch was what you did when you were ready, not when you wanted attention. They filed the incorporation papers, quietly opened the accounts, and started the first project. A 12-unit accessible housing development in East Oakland in partnership with a community land trust that had been working the site for 3 years and needed a construction and design partner who understood what accessible meant as a design philosophy rather than a code compliance checkbox. Connor handled the construction side. That had been settled in a conversation that took less time than Evelyn expected. She'd brought it up carefully, aware that she was asking him to change the shape of his professional life, to move from independent contractor to something more structured and more exposed. "I want to offer you the VP of Construction and Design role," she said. Full equity stake. You'd be building out a team managing projects at scale. It would mean, yes, he said. She stopped. I hadn't finished. I know what it means, he said. I've been watching you build this for 4 months. I know what the job is. He was quiet for a moment. Laura used to say I was good at the work, but I was hiding in it, doing it small so nothing could go too wrong. He turned his mug in a circle. I think she'd have something to say about me turning this down. Evelyn looked at him. You don't have to use Laura as the reason. I'm not, he said. She's just the clearest voice in my head when I'm being a coward. He said it without self-pity, just as an observation. I want to do this. I want to do it because it's the right thing to be doing, and because you're... He stopped, adjusted. Because I think we can actually build something real. We can, she said. Then yes, he said. Yes. The first Home True project broke ground in April. 12 units fully accessible throughout, not just the required percentage. All 12 with design features that had been developed in consultation with the future residents. Wider hallways, roll-under counters, bathroom configurations that actual wheelchair users had helped design rather than the standard adaptation that looked fine in a blueprint and was frustrating in practice. Connor managed the site with the focused intensity of a man who has found the scale his skills were always meant for. He was different on a job site than he was at the kitchen table, more certain, more authoritative, moving through the space like he owned it in the best sense of the word. His team responded to him the way good teams respond to people who know exactly what they're doing and never make you feel stupid for asking a question. Evelyn spent those months doing what she'd always done best, building the structure that made the work sustainable. Investor relations. Partnership development. The grinding, persistent work of making the case for something that didn't have a template yet. She spoke to housing authorities in 4 states. She presented to a HUD program officer in Washington on a Tuesday, and to a room full of disability advocates in Atlanta on a Thursday, and flew back to Oakland to walk the job site on Friday afternoon, where Connor showed her the framing for Unit 7, and explained why they'd modified the standard doorway placement and why it mattered. Show me, she said, and he did, and she asked the specific practical questions she always asked, and he answered them, and at the end she said, Can we do this in every unit? It adds about 4 days per unit, he said. Can we do it? Yeah, he said. We can do it. Do it, she said. Gerald came to the job site once, unannounced or nearly. He'd called her that morning and said he was in Oakland and could he come by. She'd said yes because it would have been stranger to say no. He walked the site with her, carefully, slowly watching the crew work. He didn't say much. That was unusual enough that she paid attention to it. At the end, standing at the edge of the site, looking at the framing of what would become 12 families' homes, he said, You know what I regret most? Tell me, she said. Not no, and not, I don't want to know. Just tell me. That I raised you to believe that the measure of a thing was its size, he said. Revenue, market cap, coverage area. I measured everything that way. I measured you that way. He was quiet. This is small by those numbers. 12 units. For now, she said. Yes, he said. But even if it stayed 12, it's... He stopped. It's more real than most of what I've built. She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was doing something to his face, making him look less like the man who'd sent that text, and more like a person who was trying late and imperfectly to be better than he'd been. Thank you for saying that, she said. I should have said a great deal more, a great deal sooner, he said. I know that. You've got time, she said. And then after a moment, Dad. It was the first time she'd said it to him in 8 months. She watched it land. She watched him absorb it without moving the way you absorb something you've stopped letting yourself hope for. Thank you, he said. His voice was different, smaller, more real. They stood there for a while in the late afternoon, not quite comfortable, not quite easy, but something, working toward something, which was, Evelyn thought, the most honest version of what families did when they were trying. The night the first Home True unit was completed, she and Connor stood in the empty apartment together. Just the two of them. Sophie was at a sleepover the crew had finished and gone. The building was quiet in the particular way of new spaces that haven't been lived in yet, holding the potential of everything they'd be asked to contain. Connor ran his hand along the roll under counter, checking the installation the way he always checked, with the attention of someone who understood that the details were not secondary to the work, they were the work. "It's good," he said. "It's very good," she said. "Unit 7 took an extra 6 days. "I know." "Worth it," he said. "Yes." He turned around and leaned against the counter and looked at her. That look he'd had since the bus stop, the one that registered what was real and didn't look away from it. "Can I say something?" he asked. "You're going to, regardless," she said. He almost smiled. "I've been thinking about what you said, months ago. That you didn't know what you'd love." She remembered. The kitchen table, the late evening, the question that had sat there between them like something alive. "I remember," she said. "Do you know now?" he asked. She looked around the empty apartment, the wide doorways, the hallways that would fit a wheelchair without a person having to turn sideways and feel for the 1,000th time that the space was not built for them. The kitchen counter that could be used without the daily reminder of what your body couldn't do anymore. She thought about Unit 7 and the 4 days it had taken and the family who would move in next month. She thought about Sophie explaining that looking and bugging were different. She thought about a cup of coffee in the rain and the particular warmth of something held in your hands on the worst night of your life. "Yes," she said. "I think I do." He nodded slowly, like that was what he'd expected, like he'd been watching her arrive at it for months and was glad she was there. "Good," he said, simply, quietly, in the way he said most things that mattered, and they stood together in the first home that Home True had built, in the silence of something real and completed and just beginning, and neither of them needed to say anything else. The first family moved into Home True's East Oakland development on a Thursday morning in June. Their name was Reyes, a mother named Carmen, her husband Tomas, and their 14-year-old son Diego, who used a power wheelchair and had spent his entire life navigating a world that had been built without him in mind. They'd been on an accessible housing wait list for 3 years. The apartment they'd been living in had a bathroom doorway, 11 inches too narrow. Carmen had told Evelyn this in one of the early community consultations, matter-of-factly, the way people describe things they've adapted to so completely they've almost stopped seeing them as problems. 11 inches, 3 years. 3. Evelyn was there when they moved in. She hadn't planned to be. She had calls scheduled, a meeting with a Portland housing authority that Patricia had arranged, a full afternoon of the kind of work that never actually ended. But she rearranged it. She parked near the building and watched from a distance as Connor and 2 crew members helped carry boxes, as Sophie, who had insisted on coming, had been asking about the Reyes family for 2 weeks, handed Diego a card she'd made herself as Carmen stood in the kitchen of her new apartment and ran her hand along the roll under counter, and then stood there for a moment with her eyes closed. Evelyn watched that moment. She didn't look away from it. "You okay?" Connor said. He'd come to stand beside her without her hearing him approach, which was something he'd always been able to do, move through space quietly, without announcement. "Yeah," she said. Her voice was even. "Yeah, I'm good." Carmen was up until 2 in the morning packing, he said. Diego told Sophie. He said she kept checking the boxes to make sure she hadn't forgotten anything important, but he thinks she was really just too excited to sleep. Evelyn didn't say anything for a moment. "Unit 7, she said finally. The one that had taken 6 extra days. The one with the modified doorway placement. "Unit 7, he confirmed. That was the Reyes family's unit. She thought about that for the rest of the day, turning it over the way you turn over something that means more than you can immediately articulate. By the end of that first year, Home True had completed 47 units across 3 developments in the Bay Area. The numbers, the ones Gerald had always used to measure things, were real, but they weren't the point. The point was 47 families who came home to spaces that had been built thinking about them. The point was Diego Reyes doing his homework at a desk that was the right height. The point was the woman in Sacramento who'd told Evelyn at a community meeting that she'd cried the first time she used her own kitchen without asking for help, and had then apologized for crying, and Evelyn had said, "Don't apologize, please, don't ever apologize for that." The company grew in the way that things grow, when they're rooted in something real, not explosively, not with the hockey stick curve that venture capital likes to fund, and journalists like to write about, but steadily with the compounding weight of work done well. Connor built out his team carefully, the way he did everything with attention and without shortcuts. He hired people who understood that accessible design wasn't a specialty category, but a baseline that building for the full range of human experience produced better buildings for everyone. He was a demanding manager in the way that people who care deeply about craft are always demanding, but his team stayed. That told Evelyn everything. She watched him change over that year. Not dramatically, Connor Webb was not a dramatic man, but in the specific ways that matter. The slight compression she'd first noticed in him, the quality of a person managing grief by keeping everything small and controlled, began to ease. He stood differently in rooms. He talked about the future in longer timelines. He took Sophie camping in July for the first time since Laura had died 3 nights in the Sierras, and came back with photographs that Sophie immediately added to the gallery wall and sunburn on the back of his neck, and a look in his eyes that Evelyn recognized as the look of a man who has remembered something important about himself. "How was it?" she asked the evening they got back. "Cold the first night," he said. Sophie complained about it for about 20 minutes and then got completely over it and caught 3 fish. She catch anything? No. But she threw them back, so according to her that counts. Does it count? In Sophie's system, yes. He sat down across from her at the kitchen table, their table she'd started thinking of it that way without deciding to. "We talked about Laura." Evelyn looked up. "She asked me to tell her things she didn't remember," he said. "She was 5 when Laura died, so most of what she has is fragments. She wanted more." "What did you tell her?" He was quiet for a moment. "I told her about the classroom floor, how I matched the baseboard exactly, and asked her to dinner, and she argued with me the whole time." He almost smiled. Sophie said that sounded like someone she would have liked. "She would have," Evelyn said. "Yeah." He looked at her across the table. "Sophie also said something else." "What?" "She said she was glad you were here. Not as a—" He paused, finding the right words. She was specific about it. She said, "I'm glad Evelyn is here because Dad smiles more, and also she's good at fractions." Evelyn felt something move through her chest. That's a high compliment in her system. "Highest," Connor said. "The fractions thing is serious." She looked at him. He looked at her. It was not a complicated moment. It was, in fact, one of the simplest moments she could remember, and that was precisely what made it everything. "Connor," she said. "Yeah," he said, like he already knew. "I don't want to complicate what we've built," she said. "The company, the way things work, Sophie, all of it." "I know," he said. "And I'm aware of the way it might look. Business partners living situation. It's Evelyn." "What?" "I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight," he said. "I'm just telling you that Sophie's right. You being here has mattered. You have mattered, to her and to me." He said it the way he said every important thing, without performance, without hedging, with the flat, simple courage of a man who has decided that honesty is the only currency worth spending. That's all. No pressure attached. She was quiet for a long moment. "Okay," she said. "Okay. Okay." She held his gaze. "Me too, for what it's worth." He nodded once, picked up his coffee mug. And that was that. Or rather, that was the beginning of that. The quiet, unannounced beginning of something that had actually been building for a year and a half, without either of them quite naming it the way the most real things tend to build. Home True's second year was different from the first. Not harder, more complex. They expanded to Portland and to Phoenix, 2 cities with severe accessible housing shortages, and existing community partner relationships that Evelyn had been cultivating since before the company had a name. Connor flew back and forth to Portland so often that the airport staff started recognizing him. Patricia came on full-time as CFO, leaving Carta Tech without drama and without looking back, and the quality of HomeTrue's financial infrastructure made an immediate and measurable difference. Gerald's board connections opened 3 doors that would have taken Evelyn 2 additional years to open independently. She acknowledged this to him directly, which she could tell meant something to him, and which cost her nothing, because it was true. Sophie turned 10 that year. The birthday party was in the backyard. Connor's idea, large and chaotic and wonderful 12 kids from Sophie's class, and Mrs. Patel from next door, and Patricia, who arrived bearing a cake that was architecturally ambitious and slightly lopsided, and which Sophie declared the best cake she'd ever seen in her life. Evelyn had gotten Sophie a drafting set, the real kind, technical pencils, a proper ruler, an architect's scale. Sophie opened it and looked at it for a long, serious moment. "Is this for drawing buildings?" she asked. "It's for drawing whatever you want," Evelyn said. "But yes, it works for buildings." "I want to design one of the HomeTrue buildings," Sophie said, "when I'm old enough." "I'll hold that spot," Evelyn said. "Promise. Promise." Sophie nodded satisfied and moved on to the next gift with the efficiency of a child who has gotten the important answer and can proceed. Connor caught Evelyn's eye from across the yard, and the look on his face was the same one she'd seen when Sophie named the company too large for the moment to fully contain spilling at the edges. The award came at the end of the 2nd year. The National Housing Innovation Award, not the most prominent award in the sector, not the one with the television coverage and the celebrity presenters, but the one that the actual practitioners cared about, the one voted on by the people working the problem rather than the people writing about it. HomeTrue won in the category of Accessible Design Excellence, and the organization asked Evelyn to accept it at the annual conference in Chicago. She almost said no. Awards had never been the point, and this one wasn't either. Patricia talked her into it by pointing out that the acceptance speech was essentially a national platform for HomeTrue's mission, and declining it would be a strategic decision Patricia was not prepared to support. Evelyn told her that was manipulative, and Patricia said yes, and Evelyn laughed and said fine. Connor came to Chicago. Patricia came. Gerald flew in without being asked, which surprised her, until she thought about it, and then it didn't. Sophie came too. It was a Thursday, and she missed school, which Connor had agonized about until Sophie pointed out that she'd never missed school for anything fun, and this seemed like the appropriate first occasion. Evelyn spent the flight to Chicago not preparing her speech. She'd been preparing it for 2 days already, and it was ready, and she knew it, and what she needed in the hours before wasn't more preparation, but more stillness. She looked out the window at the country passing below, and thought about the night at the bus stop, the puddle, the ring. The rain with the particular clarity that comes when enough time has passed for the worst night of your life to become simply a night. Part of the story. Not the whole of it. She thought about the 412 contacts and the one person she'd called from a parking garage in San Francisco who'd asked simply how'd it go and waited. She thought about fractions and phoenix sculptures and a gallery wall of crayon drawings and the smell of slightly too dry eggs on a Saturday morning. She thought about Carmen Reyes with her eyes closed in a kitchen that had been built for her. The conference hall held about 800 people. It was the kind of room that had good acoustics and mediocre lighting, and the particular atmosphere of a gathering of people who have all chosen the same difficult thing and find it sustaining to be in the same space. Evelyn had spoken in larger rooms. She had spoken in rooms that were more powerful, more televised, more consequential by the measures she used to use. She had never stood in a room that felt more like the right one. When they called her name, she moved to the front. The applause was warm and real. She looked out at the room and found Connor in the 4th row. He was watching her with his particular steadiness present and calm, and Sophie was beside him with the drafting pencil she'd apparently put in her pocket and forgotten, turning it in her fingers the way she turned things when she was paying close attention. Gerald was 3 seats down. He was sitting very straight. When he caught her eye, he gave a single nod, formal, precise, and she thought she saw something bright in it that she chose to believe was pride. She looked down at her notes for one moment. Then she set them on the podium and didn't look at them again. "I was abandoned at a bus stop," she said. "On a Tuesday night in October, in the rain with nowhere to go and no one to call." She let that sit. I'm not going to make that sound more dramatic than it was. It was the worst night of my life. I had just lost my company, my relationship, and my family in the span of about 4 hours. I was cold and I was hungry, and I genuinely did not know what came next. The room was very quiet. "A man stopped," she said. "He didn't know me. He owed me absolutely nothing. He stopped because it was midnight and raining, and he was the kind of person who stops. He gave me a cup of coffee, and he asked if I had somewhere to go, and when I said no, he offered me a room in his house. And I said yes, because I had run out of other options." She paused. "His daughter named this company," she said. "She's 10 years old. She's in this room tonight. Sophie, you should stand up." A beat of silence. Then from the fourth row, Sophie Webb stood up, with the solemnity of someone accepting a significant responsibility, and the room applauded, and Connor put his hand briefly on her shoulder, and Sophie sat back down with the composure of a person who has always known she was serious about her practice. The laughter in the room was the warm kind, the kind that brought people together rather than separating them. "Home True exists," Evelyn said, "because I spent 18 months in a house that taught me what building for people actually means. Not building for users, not building for market segments, for people." She looked out at the room. "I spent the first decade of my career building technology that optimized logistics. I was good at it. It made money and it solved problems and it was fine. It was fine. The building we completed in East Oakland last spring has a kitchen counter in Unit 7 that sits 4 inches lower than the standard. It took 6 additional days to install correctly. A 14-year-old boy named Diego uses that kitchen every day to make his own breakfast. His mother told me last month that Diego had started cooking dinner twice a week because he could, because the kitchen was built for him." She stopped for a moment. "That is not a small thing. I want to be clear about that. That is not a small thing." The room was still. "The measure of what we build is not square footage or unit count or return on investment, though all of those matter and all of those have to work," she said. "The measure of what we build is whether the people inside it can live, whether they can make breakfast and have friends over and move from one room to another without asking for permission from the architecture. Whether the building says, 'By the way, it was made you belong here. We thought about you. You were not an afterthought.'" She let that land. "I am going to accept this award on behalf of every person who helped build Home True. Connor Webb, who understood what accessible design meant before I did, who built the ramp on his own porch, and then built a company that builds ramps on other people's porches. Patricia Osei, who makes the numbers work with a precision and an integrity that makes everything else possible. And the residents, Carmen and Tomas and Diego, and the 46 other families in our East Oakland development, and the families in Portland and Phoenix who trusted us enough to let us build the places where they live their lives." She picked up the award. It was heavier than she expected, which made her want to smile. "I was abandoned at a bus stop," she said again, "and a stranger gave me coffee. And everything that exists tonight, this company, those homes my family grew out of that one decision by one person on one terrible night." She looked at Connor across the room. "The stranger at the bus stop didn't save my life because of anything dramatic. He saved it because he stopped, because he asked, because he was the kind of person who believes that the person in front of you, whoever they are, is worth stopping for." She looked out at the 800 people in the room. "That's the whole thing," she said. "That's the entire philosophy. That is Home True in one sentence. The person in front of you is worth building for." The applause started before she stepped back from the podium. Afterward, in the hallway outside the hall, Sophie found her first. She came at speed the way she moved through most spaces, and stopped just short of collision with the specific self-restraint of a child who has been reminded about indoor behavior. "You said my name," Sophie said. "In front of everybody." "You named the company," Evelyn said. "That deserved credit." "I didn't think you'd actually say it." "I keep my promises." Sophie considered this. "Can I have that on record?" "Ask Patricia. She keeps records." Sophie made a mental note that was visibly passing across her face. Then she said, "It was a good speech." "Thank you." "I'm going to design a building someday," she said. "A home true one. I already have some ideas." "I know," Evelyn said. "I'm counting on it." Connor was behind her. He waited until Sophie had gone to find Patricia before he said anything, and then what he said was simple. "Hey." "Hey," she said. "You good?" "Yeah," she said. "Really good." He nodded. He didn't say anything else for a moment, just stood with her in the hallway with the sound of the conference carrying from the other room, and the particular quiet of two people who don't need to fill space to feel it. "You want to get dinner?" he asked. "All of us." Sophie's already identified 3 restaurants within walking distance. Of course she has. She has opinions about the pasta situation. She always has opinions. "Yeah," he said. And the way he said it, fond and tired and completely at home in it, was the sound of a man who has found the shape of his life and recognized it. Gerald said goodnight in the lobby. He held her hand for a moment before he let go the way he hadn't done since she was small, and he said, "Your mother would have loved this. All of it." He cleared his throat. "I should have said that a long time ago, too." "Dad," she said. "You're saying it now." He nodded, straightened his jacket, walked toward the elevator with the bearing of a man who is learning in his 8th decade the difference between the things that last and the things that only seem to. She stood in the lobby for a moment after he'd gone. The award was in her bag. Her family. Connor and Sophie, who had already located the restaurant and were waiting by the door, were 20 feet away. The night outside the hotel windows was Chicago, in late autumn, cool, and lit the city, doing what cities do regardless of whatever private transformation has just occurred inside one of their buildings. She thought of the ring at the bottom of the drain on the worst night of her life. She thought of the coffee, the warmth of it. The simple, physical, uncomplicated fact of something warm held in her hands when she had nothing. She pushed toward the door. Connor held it naturally, without ceremony, without making it anything other than what it was, one person making space for another. Sophie was already outside, pointing at something across the street and explaining it to no one in particular, the way she always explained things, with the certainty of a person who has never once doubted that what she finds interesting others will find interesting too. The night was cold and clear. Evelyn Carter, who had been abandoned in the rain, who had lost everything and found something better, who had built a company not to win, but to matter, who had discovered that the greatest structure she would ever build was not made of units and doorways and accessible counters, but of the daily accumulated choice to stop, to ask, to offer something warm to the person in front of you, moved out into it. She had not arrived here because the world was kind. She had arrived here because one person in it was, and she had decided on a night when she had nothing left to let that be enough to build from. It was.